Good morning, everyone. My name is Derek Hoy, and I'm a senior program officer here at the NYHealth Foundation. I'd love to first start off by thanking you all for joining us for this incredibly important conversation in the build up to Hispanic Heritage Month starting this Sunday. Throughout our event, we'll be learning more about arguably the most famous Latino war hero in American history, my great uncle, Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavidez. And we'll also be discussing the contributions and struggles of the larger Latino American population. So we really, truly appreciate you tuning in. I'm also very grateful to have an amazing guest for this discussion, Dr. William Sturkey, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania and author of the recently published book titled The Ballad of Roy Benavidez, who you will hear more from shortly. But before we kick things off, it's with great honor and gratitude that I acknowledge the land itself and the Lenape people who have stewarded it for countless generations before being displaced. Also, a few housekeeping notes for our hearing impaired attendees like me or anyone else in need of live stream captioning. You can click on the closed caption icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select the show subtitles and/or full transcript options there. In addition to our excellent guests, we have a great audience joining us today, so feel free to send comments and questions into the chat box and share any contact info or resources you like there as well. We'd love to hear from you, and I will try to sneak in any questions I can. And just a heads up, this webinar is being recorded, so we'll be sure to send out an event recap email with a link to the video that will be sent to everyone in the next few days, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. And finally, without further ado, I'm excited to kick off this conversation. Dr. Sturkey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you today.
Thanks again. So before we dive in and focus on one particular Latino American story, I'd like to start with a wider aperture and focus on the larger Hispanic population in the US in general, a demographic that has grown from 5% of the country's population in 1970 to now over 20%, making it the second largest racial group or ethnic group, as well as one of the fastest growing. So despite this growth and prominence, journalist Juan Gonzalez points out in his excellent book, Harvest of Empire, that the history of Latinos is a story that's hardly told and it's easily glossed over from pop culture to academia and even in publishing, creating a need to elevate the stories of this population. So as someone who has recently contributed to this body of scholarship, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. It is wild to me how underrepresented Latinos are in our American history framework. Oftentimes the story of Latinos or Hispanics comes up when we talk about immigration in very recent contexts. And then even when you're teaching this, American history, it often comes up in 1960s with Cesar Chavez and the Chicano sort of, brown power movement. And then it sort of fades away from there. But Latinos have been in the United States the whole time, and they are a crucial part of the American story. And so it's a huge gaping hole. I thought, and even in my own education, I have a PhD in American history, and what we know about the experiences of everyday Latinos and Hispanics is so little compared to some of the other groups that we've studied throughout American history.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I mean, as a Mexican American, I think it's something that I grew up not knowing too much about. And even now with the connection of just like Latino American history and what I do focusing on veterans, not really realizing Cesar Chavez was a Navy veteran himself and like all
Yep.
these connections. So really cool to see that brought together. So Barbara Tuchman, one of the country's foremost historians, was once asked how best to teach history. And she famously replied with two words that I love. She said, tell stories.
Yeah.
And I couldn't agree with that more. But what's clear is not only the importance of telling stories, but also the importance of who is telling the story and why. I bring that up because the more in-depth account of the life of Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavidez is not one that's told often, if at all. So before we get into those details, how has this story been told historically? And what's been kind of focused on the most?
Yeah, so I totally agree that storytelling is the best way to teach history. And I would say that's part of the reason that history is one of the oldest professions and probably the oldest academic field of study. It's telling stories about your culture and your heritage to explain where things came from. And so the story of Roy Benavidez has been told hundreds, if not thousands of times. I would actually feel comfortable saying it's been told tens of thousands of times. most of the time it's told sort of in private settings where people tell war stories and unbelievable stories, but quite often it's been told in, like, now it's told on YouTube all the time. But it's been told in speeches, and every year today, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, the story gets told somewhere in America. It's told all the time. And how it's often told is this sort of, rise, this come up story. So this poor kid, born to this horrible, debilitating poverty in Texas. He's a sharecropper, and he joins the American military. And it's that experience in the American military that leads him to becoming a war hero, which we can talk a lot more about what happened, and then ultimately sets him on this course to be, middle class American hero, widely recognized by people all over the country, all over the world, even, but especially in the state of Texas. And so it's by joining this American army that, he's lifted himself out of poverty and become this great celebrated hero. That's usually the gist of how the story gets told.
Yeah, and I would agree again. I'm super biased on the topic. I'm so fortunate to grow up like this legend, Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez. He was just an uncle to me, not just an uncle, but he was my uncle. And even then, these are the stories that we heard. It was the war stories. It was the 6 hours in hell. It was all his funny anecdotes and things like that. And there's so much truth and importance in that. But again, that's just one facet. And to that end, I want to be sure to give you all your due flowers because the research you did for this book was impeccable. I went into it having read, watched, and listened to pretty much everything about, my Theo Roy that was out there. As you mentioned, the story has been told so much. And I would have said rather naively that I thought the canon's kind of complete. What other sources are you going to tap into? But I was clearly wrong. I learned so much new information about him, my family, the context in which he was raised, Latino veteran history, and so much more. So now that we've kind of heard a bit about what's already been told, what did you feel was missing in the prevailing narratives or needed to be fleshed out more in your book?
Well, the first thing that I thought was backstory. So I'm a very thorough historian. I have a flair for the epic, dramatic story. So I want to know the whole thing, Like
Mhm.
I want to know, how his family ended up in Cuero, Texas to start with. Like I want to know what he was doing when he was a kid. Just saying that he's poor and moving on from there wasn't quite enough for me. I wanted to know who his people were, where they came from, and all the things in their background that might shape his life and that the things that affected his life. And in doing that, I discovered something that just shocked me right away with the book. And that is that Roy's family, that your family, parts of it had been in Texas for over 100 years before he was born. I had assumed that he was the children of immigrants, and that is to, there's immigrant history obviously in his family, but on his father's side, I mean, they had been in Texas since the 1820s. And not only that, they had actually helped organize different parts of Texas, including where Victoria currently is today. And even beyond that, they had participated in the Texas Revolution in the 1830s. And so that's often a story that's, it's Davy Crockett, it's Houston, it's Austin, it's all those, seminal figures from the Texas Revolution, but the Texas Revolution was interracial, right? There were many Latinos, there were many Hispanics involved in the Texas Revolution, including the family of Roy Benavidez. And so they didn't, Roy didn't just wake up poor one day. So his family were landowners, they had participated in the revolution, and then they then lost that land through the process of Texas joining the United States of America. And so oftentimes the story that many people tell about Roy is look at, we tell the story to celebrate the United States, but it's a little bit more complicated. Like look at there's this poor kid, he's able to join the United States military, and because of that, he's able to rise up to prominence. Okay, that's one that's one version. But if you start the story back a little bit further, his family had once owned over 4,000 acres. They had a huge ranch in two different parts of Texas. And it was actually because Texas joined the United States and new American laws and all the new companies coming in and all the new settlers coming in, and his family was essentially defrauded of their land. They lost their land, and that's how they became poor. They didn't show up to the United States poor. They showed up to the United States doing quite well, actually. And it was that life in the United States that resulted in them being poor that ultimately paved the way for Roy to be born into a poor sharecropping family in the 1930s. So it's a much different backstory, and the trajectory of the story is much different. It's not just a come up story, it's actually a decline in the first chapter because you show what happens to this family during those first few decades that they lived in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. So many really great points that you touch on there. And I think going back to, hopefully to expand on that a bit, but to go back to the additional context you provided in this book, there's so much more that's been stated, as you mentioned, kind of like matter of factly about his up years, the reality of the poverty that he and his family endured. It gets brought up, but one of the other things that you do so well is, again, just like you just did, not only just explaining, what happened or the conditions, but the context surrounding it. And this reminds me, there's a great quote from Elder Camara where he said, when I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. And it really reflects on an idea that like we can talk about, some of these issues and maybe even address them, but it's kind of almost still taboo to talk about, what causes them. So maybe just to expand on that, when you went into looking into acknowledging the poverty that he faced and why he faced it in particular for his life, what more did you find?
So what happens is his family comes to help settle the area around Victoria County, 1820s. They take jobs, the prominent roles in society, school teacher, helping to organize land, and ultimately what happens is they're settling there when war breaks out, when Texas declares independence, and the Benavidez family is on the side of declaring independence, but they don't want Texas to leave Mexico. They want Texas to remain in Mexico. They ultimately lost that battle. And what happens is basically after Texas becomes its own country, which it briefly does before joining the United States, all of these Anglo people from the United States pour in. And it's not just individuals, but companies who are seeking to acquire land. And especially after Texas joins the United States, there's different processes by which they can acquire that land. One is that people just start squatting on huge parts of land, and the Benavidez family experiences this. And then they fight in the courts to try and win some of that land. They're saying we've been occupying this land. This family didn't even know that they had it. Some of the property rights. So as the sovereignty changes from Mexico to Texas to the United States, some of the property rights are challenged in court. Some of the boundaries. Somebody might say, well, there's this border that's marked on this contract from 1799, but it's now 1837 and that contract's not valid anymore, and so they challenge that in court. And that's one of the ways that landholdings start to be chipped away at too. And then the other thing is these corrupt sheriffs who come in and assess people's land for tax purposes, all these different means of doing that. And so if people can't afford the taxes on their own land, which these taxes might be exorbitant, then they might have to sell parts of that land in order to meet their tax requirement. And by that process, a lot of Hispanic families lost land as well. And these processes play out for the Benavidez family across two different generations in two different places. And ultimately, that's how they lost the land. After that, once they're landless, they become sort of nomadic farm workers. And that's basically what two generations of the family is involved with until we get to meet Roy Benavidez himself. He's born to a poor family of nomadic farm workers. They're sharecroppers, but they also move around Texas as well. So they work in East Texas, they sharecrop in East Texas, but they pick cotton all over the state as well. So that's who Roy Benavidez is in the background. And the thing is, he didn't always fully know the details of what was lost with his family. He just knew 100 years later, he was born into a poor family. And there were whispers and there were family fables that he later wrote about, but they didn't really fully, I think, appreciate the systematic, transfer of wealth and land, which is exactly what happened, that occurred in the decades before the 1880s.
Yeah, that makes so much sense because I mean, certainly these were things that like I didn't know about my family, and we have great historians like you and resources now. I can only imagine how difficult it was back then when you don't have things to look up to, or even just the idea of what could have happened because it seems pretty insane the way things went down.
Yeah.
I think in a similar vein, though, another central theme present in the story about my Theo Roy is that of race, from his nickname Tango Mike Mike being a phonetic acronym short for that mean Mexican to him being dubbed the most, famous Hispanic war hero in our nation's history. There's a lot of acknowledgement about his race, but similar to the poverty he faced, not too many folks explain the impact race had on his life, something you do extremely well in your book. So I'm wondering, can you tell us more about how race impacted him, in particular, maybe in his early years when he's experiencing this poverty?
Yeah. So race underscores the reason that the family's poor in the first place. Race is related to all the processes that I was just talking about. So it's a huge structural issue in his family. Had he, were they white, they probably wouldn't have been able to hold on to some of their land after the revolution. So there's that. That's a huge part. But then, he grows up in what we call Jim Crow era Texas. People often refer to it as Juan Crow
Mhm.
to talk about the experience of Hispanics being a little bit different than black and white. But I think a lot of people that understand, what Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about during the civil rights movement have a pretty good understanding of how racial segregation worked. But then one of the things that your uncle talked about a lot was how it affected his psyche.
Mhm.
Like he wrote books in the 1980s and 1990s, and he gave speeches throughout the 80s and 90s. And 40, 50 years after his childhood, he still talked about race a lot. And you could tell that it really cut him. So for him, it was largely about being a kid and growing up in an environment where everything that you experienced basically suggested that this was not for you, that you didn't get to be a part of all of this, that you weren't a true American citizen, that you couldn't go. One thing he talked about all the time was sitting in the front of the movie theater and trying to get a better seat and being kicked out. He talked about he was a dishwasher in a restaurant at a very young age, and he wasn't allowed to eat in the front of the restaurant because the white families might be offended by the sight of the poor Hispanic kid. And so, he lost both of his parents at a young age. And I would say that, especially for somebody that lost both their parents at a young age, this process of humiliation and exclusion and being told over and over and over again, no, you are not one of the cream of the crop of society. You are not like the white kids. Your life is not going to be like theirs. You can't do any of these things that they get to do. Like that psyche, like really stuck with him. It really hurt his self-esteem. I think as a child, it's fair to say that from what we know, from what we can tell, that he was pretty depressed. He was fighting all the time, and it just there's the structural things that many people are familiar with, but like the psyche of growing up like that really really damaged him, and made him ornery, and it set him on this path that ultimately ended up with him being a productive citizen, but it could have gone a very different way. And of course, a lot of minorities experienced this growing up in that era in American history. But yeah, the racism that he experienced in his childhood, from the everyday taunts to the inability to go get an ice cream cone where he wanted to, like all of it really cut him so deeply, so much so that he talked about it decades later, even after he became a famous American hero.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. It's so difficult because, I've been telling folks after I read your book that, I grew up with this man, knowing him, as, the image in my head. But you really just pointed out he's a human, he's a person, he had feelings, he had emotions. And we think of him because he was this stoic war hero that did just, acts of bravery that are just incomprehensible. But the idea that out of everything that stuck with him, a lot of these, indignities and things that he faced as a child really stuck with him. And it was heartbreaking to hear, but I think that's what's important to know, because if this happens to a war hero that has, I think the sympathy of people, how many folks don't have that have to endure this daily? And it's heartbreaking. And it reminds me of there's a report that came out by the New American Center for New American Security, and it came out on minority veterans. And one key takeaway is that, like you mentioned, military service can indeed help minorities overcome some structural and institutional barriers. However, they often still face the same challenges as their civilian counterparts. And this was true of my Uncle Roy. I think there's this notion that, after a storied and decorated military career, he came home to a hero's welcome and everything was copacetic. But of course, that's an oversimplification, especially considering the environment he came home to. So would you mind telling us more about how race impacted him even after an exemplary career in the military?
Yeah. So one of the things that he was definitely trying to do, he was always aware that there was racism, that people were still racist, because the same people that he grew up with were still there, after he became the war hero, sometimes literally the same names. So it's not like 30 years later, he's looking at them like, oh, they're not racist anymore. Like he remembers the experiences that he had with them, when he was younger. But the thing I'll say that that means more even beyond Roy Benavidez is the experiences that everybody carries with them from their youth. Like this is one of the most important things about making sure people have, equitable opportunities to grow up healthy and safe in the United States. Like these things are really, really dangerous for everyday citizens in ways that hurt our society. And people never get over these things. Like to eradicate racism is to also free people from the mental stigma and burdens of racism as they're growing up. And I think that for working class veterans, many of whom experience racism, many of whom come from, working class and financially impoverished backgrounds, like that's kind of always who they are, even though they might go through the military, they might get the GI Bill, they might be able to get some sort of social uplift, but a lot of that background is always carried with them. And I think it makes them more susceptible to things like sliding back into poverty or mental health challenges or any of these number of different issues that might affect their lives even after they serve.
Yeah, absolutely. And just got a question from Charles Francis in the audience. I think definitely, and pardon me because the story is so common. Maybe from your perspective, would you mind telling us about the war that he fought, in Vietnam in particular, and those 6 hours in hell?
Yeah. So Roy Benavidez is he was in the United States military from 1950. Well, he was in the Texas National Guard first, but in the United States military from 1955 until 1976. And so during that time, obviously the Cold War is happening, and he serves in a number of different hot spots. He actually serves in Latin America, a couple of missions where he was sent there. But the sort of big story of his combat experience is in Vietnam. He serves two tours in Vietnam, both of which are relatively short. The first lasts a few months. He's an advisor for a South Vietnamese unit in 1965 when he steps on some sort of crude um, landmine or some sort of booby trap or something that nearly kills him. But then when he goes back in 1968, he was working with special forces who were doing secret operations in Cambodia, highly removed from most military operations that were happening in South Vietnam at the time, and something that nobody or virtually no one in the United States knew what people like him were doing during the Vietnam. But yeah, he served in a bunch of different places, but Vietnam was where the action occurred, where he became this widely celebrated war hero.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for breaking that down. So when I was a young grad student studying history at the City College of New York, one of the first books I ever read, and it's now basically something I consider a Bible, was A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. And you could understand how blown away I was when I'm reading it, and like towards the tail end, he mentions this war veteran and how he was treated. With issues of being kicked off his Social Security benefits. And that's one thing that I never heard of growing up. There was always the war hero story and what he had overcome, and not really realizing what happened, in the early '80s. So, would you tell us more about what happened there?
Yes. So Roy Benavidez, 1968, he performs this act of valor that later earns him the Medal of Honor 13 years later. And there's a bunch of different reasons that it takes 13 years. The biggest reason is probably because the action actually occurs in Cambodia and not in South Vietnam. In any event, when he receives the medal in 1981, he becomes very, very famous. Okay. Ronald Reagan had been in office for like a month, a little over a month. And the United States was starting to get over this Vietnam War syndrome, sort of this lingering, myopia about the Vietnam War. People just don't want to talk about it. Well, Roy Benavidez gets this medal, 1981. For the rest of his life, he's the most recent living recipient of the Medal of Honors for the last 17 years of his life. Great. So for that, like he's the veteran's veteran. He's the guy's guy, all sorts of ceremonies. Like the first one at the Pentagon kicks off. It's a huge news story. It's covered every single ABC Nightly News, NBC Nightly News, national news is all over this thing. Roy Benavidez, his page is all across the front page of newspapers all across the United States and even some global newspapers. If you open up the newspaper, February 25th, 1981, the two big stories are Roy Benavidez right there, and Prince Charles and Princess Di got engaged actually that same exact day. So that's also the headline story, but they're right there together. So there's the connection between Roy Benavidez and the royal family. So he becomes really famous when this happens. And part of the reason for that is because Ronald Reagan says, I'm telling this one story. And so Reagan became the first president to read a Medal of Honor citation at the ceremony itself. And he tells this story and he makes it very clear. It's not just about celebrating Roy Benavidez. It's about recognizing all the Vietnam War veterans who, before my presidency, Reagan says, didn't get their due. Okay, we need to start doing that. It makes them very popular in the military. Ronald Reagan, that is. So Roy's famous. 2 years later, 1983, another story about Roy Benavidez breaks, and that is that he is being kicked off of the disability rolls. So SSDI, the Social Security Disability Benefit, um, Roy Benavidez receives a letter in February of 1983 saying that his benefits are being discontinued. And it's a very cold, bureaucratic letter. It says things like, we've determined that you can lift 25 pounds, or we could determine that you can stand for 6 hours, therefore you can gain employment in this atmosphere. And there was never any medical examination or anything like that. They just said, you're this age, you're this size, we want you to go back to work, basically. And so, Roy Benavidez, through his heroic act, he had incurred 37 puncture wounds, we estimate. He'd been shot over half dozen times. He has all these severe injuries because of his war, heroics that he was just celebrated for in 1981. So when this letter comes in 1983 saying, sorry, but you're no longer eligible to be on disability, it also becomes a huge national story. Not right away, but your uncle talked to reporters all the time. And he goes through this experience of appeal, and he has to go to this judge. And at one point, he has to take his shirt off in front of this judge. And it's this horrible experience. And he's talking to a reporter that spring, and he lets it slip that he was going through this. And it just, again, all over NBC Nightly News, ABC Nightly News, huge national story that America's war hero that they just celebrated at the Pentagon 2 years ago, the Ronald Reagan poster boy for military service, is now being kicked off the disability rolls. And so it's just this huge, shocking contradiction that really embarrasses the Reagan administration. It stays in the news for a couple of months. Roy Benavidez is called to testify in front of Congress about these changes with disability. Dozens of other veterans who were going through something similar, and again, working class veterans who had been enticed to join the military through the GI Bill and things like that, they were largely the ones that were being kicked off, and they're also the ones that really need the disability benefit. And so it was this huge wave where basically the Reagan administration was having this purge of disabled people who were getting checks from the government to provide for them. And Roy is right in the middle of it. And it's one thing for the Reagan administration to say, okay, well, these people don't deserve it. It's just Democrats and like the welfare queens and that sort of a thing. But when it's a war hero that it happens to, that changes everything. And so because of what happens with Roy, there are some real changes to the policy, and it really helps a lot of other veterans. But yeah, it's just this huge contradiction for an administration that says we're the greatest friend of the servicemen since World War II. Oh, and by the way, the most famous of these, take your butt back to work. So it's really quite an episode. And I never appreciated until I started reading the news stories and then also working at the Reagan Library. I did a lot of research about how the Reagan administration was interpreting this crisis. And they were terrified by it because it was right before an election year. They wanted Hispanic voters. They wanted the veteran voters, which wasn't just Vietnam, but World War II, Korea. And so it was a really big ordeal.
Yeah, thanks for breaking that down. Again, it was so brand new to me, and I had no idea. And hearing more about it, it was just truly remarkable. And it reminds me of Pat Tillman. I'm not sure if folks know
Yeah.
the story of Pat Tillman, because for me, what I've seen, and especially your book points out very well, everyone has like an idea of who Roy Benavidez was. And for the SSDI issue, a lot of progressives and liberals and Latinos saw him as a hero. A lot of conservatives have historically seen him. And Pat Tillman's the same way. Like they like to show that he gave up this $1 million contract for, to fight in the war, but he was going to meet with Chomsky after he came home. So liberals take him and people on the right take him. Do you feel that was the case for Roy Benavidez throughout his life? People just kind of took him at however they liked and used him for their own means?
Yes, absolutely. So this is something that came up all the time in studying and researching the book. The first point that I have to make is that we're so much more divided and tribalistic and wedded to partisanship, I'll say, however you want to put it. but we're more wedded to being Democrats and Republicans now than at any time in the 1980s, I would say. And so, like, people need to understand that first. So, oftentimes when something happens today, whichever tribe you're in, that's how you react. Well, the world was very different in the 1980s. And, Roy Benavidez worked with Republicans and Democrats across the aisle, often in tandem, all the time. And, there was a contest, often about who was offering the most support. And, as you say, each side tried to sort of claim him as their own. When the Social Security issue came up, he testified largely invited by Democratic lawmakers. The person that testified right after him was this emerging young governor from Arkansas named Bill Clinton, okay, in 1983. But then the Republican side as well really leaned into it, So like Ross Perot wrote the foreword to his last book. John McCain wrote a book about why courage matters that starts off with the story of Roy Benavidez. Even to this day, Steve Bannon, the Trump advisor, when he got into the White House in 2017, there was a story on Fox News about how he became a Republican, and they showed that he was at the Roy Benavidez ceremony, and that's when he really knew that Reagan was the one that really supported the military, and so on and so forth. So there's this constant back and forth now, and I think that's one of the things that's kind of tricky about the book is that it doesn't land cleanly as a Democrat or Republican book. It just doesn't live in that world. That's not the world that Roy Benavidez came of. And so, really hard pressed to pick one of those camps, which is what so many of our histories do now. It just doesn't really work out that way because, your Uncle Roy definitely saw people as Americans first. And a lot of the politicking, he understood that people wanted to use his image in certain ways. He was definitely aware of that. But he was America first. He was we're together. We're on one side first, and I'll let that sort of sit beneath me, if you will, and they can worry about. But I'm here to help promote the United States cause, its military, and help support other veterans as I can.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, because as you point out, it's never as easy, it's never as black as white. He was this, he was that. He's complex the way we all are. And I think that's something that we do a not great job of nowadays is understanding there's complexity behind a lot of folks. And I think looking at certainly family in particular, because always saw him as this guy who had been through the most horrendous thing, so nothing could have bothered him. Like he was out there doing his thing. But again, you point out how not only how his early years were a struggle, but how much physical pain he was in, how much mental pain he was in, how much he was always fighting every day. And I feel like that gets glossed over as well. Or if it does, it's told in this heroic, that's how badass he was. So let's
Yeah,
not talk about
yeah.
how he was feeling. But since you do a good job in the book of explaining a lot of these nuances, what did you kind of learn about kind of what he was going through mentally and physically, especially on the back half of his life?
Yeah. So, your uncle always had to present himself in a certain way. I don't think, and this is something that you learn growing up like that. So it's another connection to his childhood. He had to learn growing up that he could act one way around one group of people and another way around another group of people. He knew that by the time he was 6, 7 years old. Okay. And so by the time he's a famous man, I think he's pretty good at doing that. And so, like, he knows that he's often brought up to speak. So after he receives the Medal of Honor, he's invited to speak almost weekly for the next like 15 years of his life. I mean, there are times where he speaks to 10,000 school children in one week. Okay. Like he's on the road all the time. He's speaking to audiences all the time. And he knows that there are certain things the audiences want to hear, and there are certain things the audiences don't want to hear. He, based on his experiences, and I can only imagine what it's like to go through the combat that he went through, but he didn't want to go out. His story got retold basically every single time somebody read the citation for the Medal of Honor, which was almost every single event, and he had to go through reliving the most traumatic experience of his life. But he also had to talk about it too. He didn't come out and say, "Oh, I shot this person, then I shot that person, then he didn't ever do that. But people would ask him about that, and that was something that he had to deal with, and he really shied away from it. He didn't like to necessarily do that. But he also knew that he was there to make people feel good, and he was there to make people feel patriotic. And ultimately, whatever he said, whatever lesson he wanted to impart on any group, whether it was the Chamber of Commerce in Houston or fifth graders, somewhere in rural West Texas, He wanted to make them feel good about belonging to the United States of America. And so to do that, he couldn't harp on about, I grew up with all this racism and all this poverty and all of that. That doesn't make a lot of people feel good about the United States of America, especially if it's like a conservative businessman's audience. So he was
Mhm.
always playing with audiences. He always had a lot of jokes, and he always kind of sidestepped the issues of poverty and race in a particular way that he didn't have, a real critical analysis that would have really challenged his audiences. But he said, I overcame these things. Let's all celebrate America. Let's end racism. Don't be prejudiced anymore. So he always left with those sorts of messages. But he was very careful about what he said and how he said it and who he would criticize. He never offered any sort of open major critique of the Vietnam War itself. He just sort of critiqued some of the people behind the scenes that were unnamed officials.
Mhm.
But he was very, very smart, very carefully curated about what he could say and what he couldn't say. And ultimately, what he wanted people to do was appreciate the military, celebrate him, but then also end racism. There was also that, but then also, celebrate American veterans and support them.
Yeah, and I don't want to like gloss over the fact that it gets easy to hear what you mentioned and think like, oh, he kind of took a step back and said what he needed to when he needed to. But it also makes it seem like he didn't have opinions on things, which is not the case. He had opinions, he had thoughts, but also he didn't really have a good network, right, to share a lot of these, I think, things with. You mentioned like when he was going on the road, he'd befriended some people from the local, newspaper and things of that nature. But can you tell us more about who he was kind of confiding in and how he was able to, I think, vent about a lot of these things that sound like they were just pent up for decades?
Yeah, so he was a friend of pretty much all servicemen at all times.
Mhm.
He could go anywhere and be close with somebody else in the service like that. That's just kind of the brotherhood that he was a part of. But his closest friends, his absolute closest friends, and the people that he confided in the most, and the people that had conversations that we'll never know about, were largely other Latino veterans. Especially if they were airborne, especially if they were special forces, and those are the guys that he's buried with in San Antonio today. So he was always part of the military community. He was always hanging out on bases, at American Legions, at VFWs, that sort of camaraderie with the other soldiers. And like airborne bars and things like that. But his closest friends were other veterans who served not just in Vietnam. He had other friends that served in World War II as well, another generation of Hispanic American veterans. Um, but yeah, that's who he confided in. That's who he was really close with. And one thing that people say about him is when he was in the room with you, you felt like you were the only person there. So he was always, supporting people that were struggling. He was a mentor for Latino veterans that came after him. And this is all over his letters. A huge part of his archival collection are all the letters that he received from different places. And there's so many different people, especially Hispanic American soldiers, who wrote in saying, can you give me this tip or that? Like, I grew up in this way and I experienced racism like this. Like, how does it make sense for me to join the army? Like, can you give me some guidance about that? So he was really plugged in, especially to that community. But I would say really also plugged into pretty much all veterans groups and all veterans communities.
Yeah, and one other thing that I was really taken by when I read your book is, again, humbling me to realize that there's so much more behind this person that I thought I knew relatively well because I just had the proximity and all these kind of legendary stories. But I thought, wow, and shout out my cousins, because just thinking about, wow, that must be so cool. Your dad grew up this iconic war hero, but then also realizing like how tough this must have been for the family, seeing
Yeah.
your dad with all these scars, these traumatic stories about, waging great acts of violence and being known for that. But it also like shout out the family because they were just so supportive of my tia Lala, like all the things that they must have gone through, and you don't hear any of their stories. It's always my Theo Roy, rightfully, because he did a lot of heroic things, but he was part of this very close knit family. And I appreciate you discussing their role. Could you tell us a little bit more about kind of the role his family played in my Tia Lala and supporting him through all of these rehabs and instances?
Really extraordinary. And I think this is true of a lot of public figures. Like Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't there the day his own kid desegregated elementary school because he was busy on the road.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
I'm not comparing your uncle to Martin Luther King Jr. Just the point that a lot of these people don't get to be there all the time with their families when they're really famous and in demand. And that was definitely the case with Roy Benavidez. He was, after he received the Medal of Honor, he was gone all the time. He got invites to speak all over the place. And through those speeches, he touched so many people's lives. He was such a powerful speaker. I get emails to this day. I got one last week from a guy that was at West Point when Roy Benavidez spoke there,
Mhm.
and what it meant to him and how he remembers that. And that was over 40 years ago.
Mhm.
And so, like, that matters a lot. And I think that's part of the reach that Roy Benavidez had. But at the same time, of course, if he's gone all the time, then he's not doing all the normal, roles in the household. So, all of his children, who I interviewed all three of them extensively, and not just talking about, what your father was to the outside world, but what he was to you and how he interacted with your family. And so that was one of the things about Lala, is that she was everything to them when she was on when her husband was on the road. She was the, in the PTA, she was the homeroom mom. She picked him up and, took him to school and made all their meals and everything else. And then sometimes they went with him too. And so they might not go with him for like a week-long speaking tour, but if it was something nearby, like the one example I'm thinking of is he had a speech at Fort Polk in Louisiana, and he took his family with him because they could just drive over there. And Denise, his oldest, it was her 16th birthday, and like she didn't want to give up her birthday and being with her friends in order so that her father, she called it Fort Swamp something or another. And so that was really hard of them to have to share their father with the world like that, both in his absence, but then also the way that it would disrupt their family time. They love to take vacations. Roy wanted to show his family as much as he could of this country that he loved. And I know he brought him up to here to Philadelphia. They went to Hawaii. They went to all these different places. But anytime he would go somewhere, people would recognize him. And it could be on the plane. Like they used to announce when celebrities were on the plane. Maybe they still do. I just haven't heard that recently. But whenever Roy flew, they would often announce Medal of Honor recipient Roy Benavidez is on the plane. And so he's sitting there with his family, and throughout the whole flight, people are coming up. I wanted to shake your hand. I wanted to meet you. Same thing happens. They go out to dinner in Honolulu, and people are coming up to his table like, oh my gosh, I read about you and I want to meet you, and interrupting their family time constantly. So, you know, real struggle for the family at times. But of course, they're very proud about the way their father was treated. And of course, the backdrop of race and being Hispanic American is in the background of all of this. And so, yeah, it's a lot of give and take with being a hero and the way that he was, for him and his family.
Yeah, and that makes me think of the tail end of his life. And one thing in particular was actually, to be honest, it was just heartbreaking to hear, realizing that he's been struggling so much with his health, and all the things he had been through. Department of Veterans Affairs, I tell folks this all the time: best healthcare in this country, best coordinated care is cheaper, faster, better health outcomes. Phenomenal healthcare across the board. Research, I'm biased, but also objectively, research has shown consistently how good it is. But that's not to say that everyone has perfect healthcare there. And what I was really taken aback by, one, really cool to see the connection between, like, wow, I was at the same, enlistment processing center that my dad went to, that
Oh,
my
really?
boy went to, that, Muhammad Ali famously
Yeah.
was at. So that was so amazing. But also, like, my dad and I went to get vaccinated at the Houston VA, and like that's where my Uncle Roy was. Which is like cool to have that connection. But you had mentioned how tough this must have been. He was there at VA, and people would treat him like a celebrity, and he's trying to recover, trying to hang on to his life. And how difficult that must have been. People would just walk into his room and want to talk to him and ask him about, his, war exploits, and they actually ended up kind of like smuggling him out of the Houston VA. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah. And so this was a part of the book, I've heard so many different things about different VAs, and there's obviously a lot more research and storytelling that needs to be done about the VA and the importance of it. But
Mhm.
certainly part of this book, especially in the early 1980s, um, veterans, were writing to Roy Benavidez about what was going on with the VA in other parts of the country. And there was actually a sit-in at the VA in Los Angeles from a group of Vietnam War veterans. But then at the same time, so the VA, as you say, takes care of so many millions of people, and it's such an important um, hospital system throughout the United States. And so Roy, when he was really struggling with his health in the late 1990s, was often going to the Houston VA, and his family They've all told me this story independently about the struggles that they had. And as far as I could tell at the Houston VA, it was basically some poor leadership and some poor policies where people were letting all these different random people visit this celebrity in his room. He was never staying at the VA for an extended period of time, like several weeks or anything like that, but he might stay overnight here and there. And the family got word that there were these people coming in that, they were giving access to, oh, we want to go see Roy Benavidez. Well, sure, he's up in the hospital. Let's take you up to go see him. And obviously that's could be very detrimental to his health. At one point, something this custom watch that he had went missing, and they were very unhappy with sort of the responses they were getting. And so yeah, they pulled him out. They took him to San Antonio, and he started going to BAMC there instead of going to the Houston VA. But as far as I can tell, it wasn't necessarily an indictment on the whole VA system at all. It was what was going on in that particular VA in Houston in the late 1990s.
Yeah, and I think it just kind of builds on the fact that like how you would think that if you've done what he has done, that like everything is just cool afterwards and everything would be fine. But how much he was still struggling, the family was struggling with healthcare, with just having access to their father, et cetera. And I think that was a really really important point to bring home, which you did very well. I think just since we're kind of running a little low on time here, just want to offer for folks in the audience, would love to hear from you all if you have any questions. But just to throw kind of a little light around some quicker pointed questions at you. Since you've done so much research, just in person, digging through the archives, et cetera, was there anything left on the cutting room floor that you couldn't elaborate on your book that you would have liked to have?
Yeah, there were all sorts of stuff. I got really into. So Roy was born in Cuero, Texas, where his mother and father were sharecroppers, and they lived. He was 3 when his father died, and I wanted to find where they were buried, and that was very, very difficult. I do feel pretty satisfied where that I found where his mother was buried in an unmarked grave in the city of Cuero. But like for poor Hispanic sharecroppers in the 1930s who died of tuberculosis and lived out on the range somewhere, we could never find his father's gravesite. It's on some privately held ranch. Um, you know, it's basically 1 or 2 different places, but then you'd have to get access, permission from the families, and it's hard to contact them and that sort of a thing. So there were some gaps like that, but I really wanted to find where his parents were buried. That was one thing that I could never quite fulfill.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I think kind of on that note too, one thing that was common throughout the book from like losing his parents at a young age and I think wanting to belong. And he went through great lengths to belong, either with the family, with the Green Berets, Army, you name it. How important was belonging to him? And do you think that he ever found it?
I definitely think that he found it. He found it in this unique way. Um, and he's this kid. He's so smart. He's so sensitive. He's so deeply affected by his childhood and this experience of exclusion. Man, when he gets to the Pentagon and the generals are there, and the color guard is there, and the president and the secretary of defense and the secretary of the army and the vice president and all their wives, and they're all there for him.
Mhm.
Yes, he definitely felt like he belonged on that day. And part of it too was, there's a class division within the army, of course. So
Mhm.
he knows, the commanders and those types of folks, the guys that went to West Point and all of that. This is a guy that dropped out of school when he was 14. He was never going to go to West Point. He was never going to be a general. This is a poor kid. He got his GED um, while in the army, but he was kind of like, yeah, I belong in the army too. I'm not just this uneducated grunt, like you all are here to celebrate me today. And
Mhm.
so there was sort of a game within the game, like, hey, I'm an American, I deserve to be recognized too. But then also like, hey, I'm a badass warrior and like I deserve to be recognized within the structure of the army itself. And I think that was also really important.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So is there one thing or a thing or two that you would want folks to walk away knowing after reading your book?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that to me, the most important thing to take away and to appreciate is that there can be a very big difference between how we say we celebrate Americans,
Mhm.
especially veterans, and the public policies that actually affect their lives. So, one of the things that got me so interested in the book was being of the war on terror generation. I myself did not serve, I have many friends who did. And it was just the difference between the way that we celebrate them on YouTube and at the football, halftime shows and that sort of a thing versus like the struggle for resources and education and mental health that actually gives veterans what they need. Celebrating somebody at the halftime of a football game isn't going to stop them killing themselves if they're like have serious depression and really serious mental health problems. There are other resources and policies that can actually help people live a better life. And so that was one of the things with Roy, even though he was so celebrated, at the end, he was, and Ronald Reagan talked about him all the time. They loved to celebrate Roy Benavidez. He didn't just get celebrated in 1981. He went back to the White House on several occasions, you know, um, and he was, trotted out there. But then at the same time, like he didn't really have all the resources that he needed. And thank God he was able to protect his own disability benefits. Otherwise, he definitely would have died much younger. He would have had a much worse life if he would have had to go back out into those fields. And so like to me that's one of the sticking points, because this is going to be an evergreen issue. I'm always going to be on the war, the war on terror generation. We're just going to get older, and it's just not enough to say that we recognize veterans because we stand for the flag or we have one particular holiday. Like these policies, especially because the Army is so filled with non-white working class people, like we've got to really make sure we have a long-term vision of how to make sure that we not only honor veterans in public, but allow for them to live productive, happy lives in private as well.
Yeah, and I think, on that kind of topic, there's so much that I think is extraordinary about his life, but I can't help but to look back and think what's like really remarkable is that none of these little instances where someone could have, ended his army career, where these fights he could have got into, he could have got punished and kicked out. Even after what he did in May of 68, it took him fighting so long to receive the Medal of Honor. Had he not received the Medal of Honor, a lot of these issues wouldn't even have come to the fore. And as you mentioned, it would have been even harder for him to come back to a place that's pretty hostile to Latinos in general. I think of Jose Campos Torres in particular. I don't know if folks know about him. He's another famous, Vietnam veteran, but he was killed a year after my uncle returned to the area. Gil Scott Heron wrote a famous song, the poem for Jose Campos Torres, and he was a Vietnam veteran. He was drinking in a bar. 5 white police officers beat him to death and threw him in Buffalo Bayou. They were all pretty much acquitted. And they didn't know what his story was. He was just another Latino that happened to be a Vietnam veteran. And the fact that all these, this environment was the one that he came home to before he had the Medal of Honor and the recognition. It's so scary to think that, things could have turned out so much differently from him all throughout his life. And I'm glad it on the whole worked out, but it's really eye-opening to think that, man, he just got lucky so many times and was charming enough that people loved him. They wanted to keep him around, but that's not the case for a lot of other folks. And it shouldn't take the Medal of Honor to have that kind of recognition. Um, was there anything that really kind of surprised you when doing research for this book?
Yeah, a couple different things, but if I could just add to your last point,
Please
like one of the
resist.
things he did, he stood up and and he demanded to be recognized, and he spoke up when things were wrong, and he made sure that he fought to be a part of all of this, that he got to be included. He fought for every single bit of it, and I think there's a lesson for that too, that you can't just necessarily sit around waiting for the right thing to happen, in your life. That you've got to go out and get it, and that's what he certainly did, not just in his actions during the war, but certainly in the years afterward. In terms of what was surprising, the family background that we talked about before, I just really couldn't believe that. And then also it was really interesting to me, thinking about like his parents died when he was young, and he was raised by his aunt and uncle. And again, like so much of the Hispanic American history that we read about is sort of the 1960s and the great workers strike and all of that. But his aunt and uncle were a different generation, what's called this Mexican American generation, and they were deeply invested in assimilation and sort of the politics of Mexican American belonging in the 1930s and 1940s. I personally did not appreciate how many Mexican Americans fought in World War II and what they thought that service was going to bring to them, and it ultimately failed. And so when Roy came along a generation later, he's part of this group that's saying, well, we want to do the same thing by proving that we're going to serve the country, but we want to belong. And he's the first generation where it really worked. So I didn't really fully appreciate this extensive history of Mexican Americans and Latinos, with their military service throughout the 20th century and what that entailed. So that was very much in conversation with Roy Benavidez. Like when he was growing up, you know, the heroes in those communities were oftentimes Mexican American World War II veterans.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think worth pointing out too, one, we're talking about Latinos and Hispanic Americans, which is not a monolith. Of course, Mateo Roy, Mexicano, but also half Yaqui, indigenous as well. And this is, the story of one. But also what you mentioned, Chad Williams wrote a really, really great book called The Wounded World. About W.B. Du Bois and this in the African American community as well. Dr. Delmont, we did an event with him about a year
Yeah.
ago. And it was the same thing. Like we will go abroad to fight so that we have our rights coming home. And it was true for Mexican Americans, for so many other people, certainly the African American community. And it's really important, I think, to see those common threads to where, one, these aren't monolithic communities, but two, there's a lot that brings them together. And service has been seen as something that should get
Yeah.
you that honor. And sadly, that's not the case. So I think it's really great to point out. Um, did your perspective or perception of Roy Benavidez change quite a bit from kind of start to finish of researching and writing this book?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I really got to know him so well, um, especially with his children. You know, I met Lala toward the end of her life. I think it was about 3 years before she had passed, but she had dementia. I think it's fair to say, and you know, I couldn't really speak with her about her ex-husband, but the kids talked about him all the time, and I got so much of his personality. You know, like he was really goofy. He was really smart in particular ways. He was really funny. You know, like he teased them and taught them lessons. He read all the time. He was very serious about, you know, politics and paying attention to current events. So it was really great to get to know him in that way. And he was, you know, there were great jokes throughout his collections. He kept, like, you know, these jokes that he had. Um, you know, if we had more time, I'd be happy to share some of them. But the one thing for me is somebody that came of age in the early 2000s and sort of, you know, saw all the stuff about 9/11 and was, again, like so many people I grew up with went and served. And I I came into the research for the book thinking that a lot of the military gestures were kind of shallow and that they were meant to cover up something else, to be honest with you. But I have a whole new appreciation for the ceremony and the pomp and circumstance. Like they just mean so much to people like Roy Benavidez. And I think maybe a lot of civilians like myself don't really fully appreciate, you know, sort of the brotherhood and the meaning of those ceremonies and traditions to the people that serve. And I have such great respect for all of those going forward. You know, I just thought they were, you know, I kind of thought some of it was like BS, you know, like, okay, we have a YouTube video of a guy reuniting with his daughter, but then, you know, we're going to send him back into war in a way that might not be helpful for that relationship or his long-term health. It seemed like, well, if you're going to support the troops, don't send them into harm's way like that. But you know, there's just so much more to it that I've really come to appreciate, and sort of all the things matter. You know, in terms of sort of the small cultural gestures of the military, but then, like I said, the pomp and circumstance too.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And again, just want to thank you so much for writing this book, but also just teaching me so much more about my family and things that are very important to me. I think honoring this legacy and fully fleshing it out more is really how you honor it instead of just telling like these tropes and reiterating these kind of same stories being told. But on that note, just want to be sure to give you a platform. Would you mind telling us who the book was actually dedicated to?
So the book was dedicated to Roy Benavidez and all those like him who served. It was also dedicated to my friend Don Oakes, who I grew up with, graduated high school with. He was killed in Kuwait in 2003, in April of 2003.
Mm.
So, like I said, you know, a lot of people I knew and grew up with served. Not all of them are with us anymore, and so that turned my attention to veterans stories and veterans affairs. And that's about the time I heard the story of your of Roy Benavidez.
Yeah, well, no, I appreciate that. Like I said, I just want to make sure to give your opportunity to honor all of these folks and all the folks that aren't with us today. Is sadly a large part of what military service means, and I think what brings a lot of this home. So again, I really appreciate you joining us today, writing this book. Unfortunately, definitely running out of time. So wanted to wrap things up here. But Dr. Sturkey, truly can't thank you enough for joining us today. In addition to writing such an excellent, thoughtful book on a member of my family, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Would love to keep it going, but hope everyone in the audience found it is insightful and informative as I have. We did just barely scratch the surface, so I can't recommend folks in the audience checking out The Ballad of Roy Benavidez enough. In addition to your other excellent writings, great book on Hattiesburg, I recommend folks checking out as well. Like to quickly give a shout out to my colleague Shannon on our communications team for all the behind the scenes work to make this happen. It's truly appreciated. If you're still on Twitter, be sure to follow us at NYHealth Foundation and myself at Classic Decoy. Dr. Sturkey, any kind of to wrap up, how can folks stay in touch or keep an eye out for anything you have coming down the pike?
Yeah, sure. So I teach at the University of Pennsylvania, and my webpage is pretty easy to find. I'm next writing a book on a narrative history of America in the 1960s, that really kind of takes us away from the classic civil rights Vietnam story, although that's a big part of it, and has a lot more to do with sort of what's going on with everyday people on the ground and some other changes that I think a lot of people have missed from the 1960s.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, definitely, folks, be sure to check them out. Also, sign up for our newsletter on our website if you haven't more to hear about web events that we have coming up. And thanks again to our amazing guest, Dr. William Sturkey, for the incredible conversation with us this morning. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me.
Truly my pleasure.